William Shakespeare, the soul of the age, according to Ben Jonson, one of his contemporaries. Here's a little bit about the playwright. Feel free to stop the video and go ahead and skim and scan this article about the playwright. Stop the video, skim and scan this article about the playwright. Look, according to eminent Shakespearean historian and chronicler and literary expert Dr. Marjorie Garber out of Harvard, who I had the opportunity to work with briefly in a week at Phillips Exeter Academy in New Hampshire for their Shakespeare conference, which is amazing. If you can go, you're very lucky. Maybe this is something like what Elizabethans and Jacobeans would have dressed like for a formal dinner, for example. Here's the Thames that cuts through the center of London. Here's the Globe Theatre, in traditionally kind of a not the nicest neighborhood, at least when it was originally opened. The Globe has since been rebuilt by an American who helped fundraise and rebuild the Globe Theatre, which you can go see a performance of Shakespeare today. They perform all the time. But in Shakespeare's day, they did not go to see a play or see a movie as we would see. They went to hear the play, to hear a play. That verb is very different. Think of that. See versus hear. We are a more visual culture. They were a more auditory culture. Again, the Elizabethan audience would pick up on words and various meanings that we might not. I think the best resource for understanding a time and era is the people of that time and era. So there's a little role-playing scenario game on Canvas that we're going to play. We just want to recreate the excitement of attending a play at the Globe in Elizabethan England, of course named for Queen Elizabeth I, not the one that recently passed. It's 1600 whatever, give or take, and you got to embody the behavior and speak in the style of your persona. Everybody from the Queen herself down to a lonely butcher or baker that might be a groundling viewing the play. Here's Queen Elizabeth. What can you say about her based on this image? Take a moment, pause the video, and write down what you see. What do you see, and what does that say about her? Okay? What do you see, and what does that say about her? Pause the video and write down at least 3 things. Okay, I've assumed that you've written down 3 things. There's a lot to talk about. Jewels encrusted in her gowns. Certainly not something I possess. These fancy bows. Tons of jewelry suggesting her wealth and extravagance. Hand on the globe like this is mine. Think the sun never sets on the British Empire as they colonized all kinds of parts of planet Earth. A lot of people today, like to gripe about colonizers, but colonizers did a lot of good just as much as they did ill. And if you don't tell a balanced story of both, you don't know the history, period. Okay? Here she is recalling her fond defeat of the Spanish invasion. The Spanish Armada was huge, massive ships, but she had a bunch of little ships. But the little ships, led by, I think it was Sir Walter Raleigh, burn a lot of the big galleys of the Spanish Navy, and the Spanish Navy is over. And it's really the end of Spain as a power on the planet. When Queen Elizabeth dresses in armor, rides a horse, and gives a great speech to rouse her troops to action. You can go read that speech online. Again, a crown suggesting her power, her control, her wealth, her extravagance, her, you might say, beauty. We have kind of a picture of a guy who's lower than, kind of serving her, beneath her, so to speak. A lot more you could say. Well, how has English changed over the last 1,000 years? A lot. I'm sure you don't even recognize Old English. This says the same thing in Old English as this does in modern English. We see the progression of the language to what they called Middle English. You're recognizing more terms. And then in Shakespeare's era, the King James Bible, named for King James, who came after Elizabeth. You probably recognize most things here. It's just a little maketh, leadeth action, a little different. And then, of course, the modern year. What will it look like in another, 200-300 years? I don't know, but I do know supposedly I've read teen girls are at the forefront of language changes. Here's the globe in the modern era. I've been there. It looks just like this. It's super cool. Here's the inside. We would have maybe heaven up here, hell down beneath the stage. Here's the stage proper. The groundlings would be seated here. Maybe some lords or nobles would be in the more wealthy, affluent areas. It is open air. Performances typically took place during the day. This one, of course, is during the night. That's why, there's lots of, characters speaking things like, "Oh, it's dark out," to cue the audience into the fact that it's nighttime. Since, again, performances typically took place during the day, this one, a rare one in the evening, kind of pretty cool. I would love to have seen this. Well, what kinds of things would you see on the way to the theater? Well, there'd be all kinds of people selling their wares, butchers, bakers, candlestick makers. There's bear baiting. Okay, in the modern era, there's cockfighting, where obviously none of us do this for the most part, but some people do, or dog fighting, like Michael Vick, the former quarterback for the Atlanta Falcons. Instead of dog fighting or cockfighting, they would tie a bear to a stake. Okay, so when you hear characters like Macbeth say, "I'm tied to a stake," this is what he's talking about. Okay, he feels like a bear being attacked by dogs. Now, we're not reading the Scottish play that I just said, but people around here, they would watch the action, they would maybe bet and gamble. The dog's going to win, or the bear is going to win. Brutal, yeah. Is there some kind of bloodlust that humans have? I don't know, but let's play around with some Shakespearean insults next. I have a Shakespeare insult kit and insult generator that we're going to look at, and just playing with the language, okay, just to be saucy, not to hurt anybody's personality, self-esteem, self-worth. Here are some fun ones you can stop and take a look at. How do people die in Shakespeare's plays? Well, most of them are stabbed, as you would imagine, the swords being the best technology of the era, for the most part. We have other interesting things here. Ripped apart by mob, that's going to take place in Julius Caesar. Look forward to that. Let's see, what are some of the amusing ones? Baked into a pie. Yes, that South Park episode where Cartman bakes his enemies into a pie. It is based on Shakespeare, a little bit, at least. Just drops dead, simply just dies, okay, of a broken heart. That's Enobarbus and Antony and Cleopatra, kind of the second part of Julius Caesar. Look, literature was politics, and accordingly it was censored. He had to be under the protection of a noble or the queen eventually, as Shakespeare was able to be. There was a guy who refused to tip his hat to Queen Elizabeth, and you know what she did? She lopped off his hand for it to always remind him, tip your hat to the queen. Someone turned her back. A guy turned his back on her once. I think it was, I can't remember the guy's name. And she boxed his ears because he dared turn his back on her. Of course, you're not supposed to do that to a queen. So you had to have a royal proclamation to protect what you wrote. Someone read what you wrote before your performance was allowed to be staged. It was really to protect the players that Elizabeth gives authority to what they call the master of revels, kind of like the person who reads the play and censors it. They were sensitive to political content, so changes did have to be made sometime, especially when we're dealing with civil unrest or any question of authority. You would refuse to pass those plays out there at all. Shakespeare did feel the heat of censorship. For 12 years, the scene in Richard II, where he's deposed, is omitted. And some conspirators plan to overthrow the queen, and they stage the play. And this alarms the queen, who snaps in outrage, "I am Richard II, know ye not that?" In other words, in the play, when Richard II is criticized or beheaded, it's symbolic of her. So she didn't want it performed because, of course, that would encourage rebellion, maybe limit your power, maybe get you overthrown. And there were countless attempts to overthrow Elizabeth. They call it the Golden Age, but there were people constantly trying to kill her, usually Catholics, because she was, part of the Church of England, Protestant, and Catholics and Protestants had that whole thing going for a couple hundred years, until recently, I guess. Hopefully it seems to have died down. But you can't use profane names, the Holy Ghost or the Holy Trinity. Here's Shakespeare maybe at a tavern talking with Ben Jonson and other playwrights hanging out, as they may have done. So in reading Shakespeare, Ben Jonson, and his contemporaries, it's important to remember that every word was scrutinized by authorities who feared the stage and were on the lookout for evidence of treason. Shakespeare was only the third most popular play in London during his lifetime. His peak popularity was 100 years after his death. You have to ask how many geniuses are hidden now in plain sight, and public opinion just doesn't recognize them yet. We had, in the play itself, three classes of people: patricians, Rome's aristocracy, the aristocratic class. Only they could be chosen in the Senate to serve as consul to run the Republic of Rome. Consuls were heads of state, commanders-in-chief for the military. There was usually two, so that one person didn't gain too much power. That whole balance of power thing that we have in the United States is not new. We borrowed it from ancient Rome, who probably borrowed it from ancient Greece, who probably borrowed it from some other culture that I'm not aware of. So there were times of deep strife where a dictator was appointed, but only for 6 months to protect Rome. Everybody else usually was a plebeian or an enslaved person. Plebs were, the people, the common people. Plebs was a word never spoken by a nobleman without a curling of the lip, kind of disgust. But the plebs took a certain pride in it. A description only spat as an insult came to be a badge of identity. And in Rome, such badges were highly prized. Kind of like today, how queer used to be an insult, but it's been kind of reclaimed by the queer community, some of them at least, who welcome that term and are proud of it. So when Caesar in the play and in history, because this is a historical tragedy, crosses the Rubicon, it's a river, he essentially is saying, I want to be a dictator. And he's essentially saying, the Republic is over and I'm now in charge. It's evident to the citizens in Rome that they've been blessed by, God, and maybe Caesar's preordained to rule. These are some gladiator shin guards from the 1st century. They were elaborately decorated. They show an image of Bacchus, a god, and the lion skin of Hercules. A Roman citizen divided himself by the fellowship of others and shared joys, sorrows, ambitions, fears, festivals, elections, and disciplines. Roman road, check this out. This is really cool stuff, just to get an idea of what one looked like. There you go. An ancient Roman rocked this path. And I gotta be honest, it's better than the roads in Toledo, Ohio. If you go to Toledo, Ohio, they're the worst roads I've ever seen in my life. I'd rather drive on this than the roads of Toledo, Ohio. It is really shameful, actually. Cleveland's not much better. Columbus is doing pretty good, I think, comparatively. So there's barely a house in Rome that doesn't have a service pipe or gushing fountain. Not really. The slums didn't have that. Okay, the person that said that didn't tour the slums for sure. At every social level, citizens are struggling to emulate, or if possible, surpass the achievements of their ancestors. Julius Caesar, Brutus, Cicero, Cato, the guys in the play, they're no different, Cassius, than this quotation here that says a lot about them. Honor was the truest measure of a city and a person. No true citizen could endure being a slave. This was a truth written in the blood of Rome's history. You'd rather be dead than be enslaved. This sarcophagus shows a Roman wedding ceremony. For the wealthiest, the ceremony saw the bride dressed in a white robe and veil. That probably sounds familiar to our culture. There's a lot about our culture that we have in common with ancient Rome. They had a matron of honor who joins in the hands of the brides and the groom, and the marriage would formally be legally sealed with a kiss. Okay. There's freedom of movement that Roman slaves enjoyed. It was conceived in the enslaved person's best interests. It was about intelligent management of these people who could sometimes become free, like the great Epictetus, who was an enslaved person who later became free and wrote great literature about how to live, Stoicism. As for the master, since he returns to power, he continues to hold on to the enslaved person and gets to kind of make him happy where appropriate, but is usually indifferent to the state of their fortunes. So from the master's point of view, the freedom of movement that a Roman slave enjoyed was motivated by the master and the slave's best interest so that they could do what they needed to do, walk around and solve the problems for the master. This was a standard discovered in Egypt in 1911. It shows kind of a detachment of soldiers with the main legion. It's dated to the 3rd century. There's only one to survive. So when Romans were carrying their banner, their flag, their standard, this is what it would have looked like maybe. At least one of them. There's more here on Roman culture that I think is absolutely fascinating. You should pause the video and take a look. Roman fathers didn't have children. They took them, including adopting a child, which was then totally their own. Sometimes they would leave a child in the forum, unclaimed, if they were deformed, and would be left to the elements to die. You were supposed to have 3 children as a Roman woman. You would have done your duty if you would have done that. Agrippina was murdered by the evil emperor Nero, who exposed their child in an act of protest. After hearing about this, someone took their own child and put a note on the child and left it in the forum to die as a protest against the evil Nero. You should strive to become the equals of gods. You want to be self-sufficient and indifferent to fortune's blows. There's ambivalence between the master and the enslaved person. Rising somewhat socially was better for the enslaved people, often. Patricians or nobles did not dress themselves or put on their own shoes. Boys and girls and women never went out without a veil or a chaperone. Kissing on the lips between men at first was opposed, but later became a sign of affection. And there's lots of interesting stuff here. Wealth means nothing, an ancient might say. What he's really saying is, I wish that I could understand and live by the idea that wealth means nothing. It's something they're aspiring to. Here's Rome, 44 BC, the era of that's the era of Antony and Cleopatra, which comes after Julius Caesar, 40 to 44 BC, give or take, 40 to 50 BC in there, the whole Caesar and Antony and Cleopatra story. But before this play takes place, one of the most powerful men in Rome, Pompey, who's a chief rival with Caesar, is kind of in opposition. And Pompey's friends in the Senate did everything he asked them to do. Pompey is as famous, if not more, than Caesar, conquering 856 different tribes. Pompey conquering more territory than any Roman ever had before him. But Caesar defeats Pompey in 48 BC. He's elected consul of Rome, called the Unconquerable God. Caesar is merciful to those that oppose him. He gives prominent positions to Cassius and Brutus, who opposed him in the civil war and teamed up with Pompey. Would he use his power to reform and strengthen the republic for the good of all? Or did he intend to establish a new monarchy with himself as emperor? Here's Caesar. We weren't quite sure. He was a dandy. He wore his belt too loose. His clothing was too fashionable. He was accused of being effeminate, even being submissive, which was a way of saying he had a relationship with the Eastern king. This probably was not true. This is probably just propaganda, but I don't know. Caesar stuns many when he's elected to be the highest priest in the land. He's awarded a governorship of 3 provinces for 5 years, a rare thing. But when he crosses the Rubicon, he says the die is cast. In other words, I'm going to be a prince or a pauper by the end of the night. And indeed, he eventually does defeat Pompey the Great. Caesar versus Cato. Cato is a Stoic. Cato is someone I admire more than anybody in the play, just about. But here is kind of a bit about their relationship. You should pause the video and read this to see kind of the difference between Caesar and Cato. Pause the video and make a T chart and discuss the similarities and differences between Caesar and Cato. Cato, I guess that's a cool guy. So he's merciful, as I said, which is following law of power too. Okay. He understands that strong leadership means generous treatment of former enemies. Lots of times, if you treat an enemy generously, they end up being your friend. I think Lincoln said something similar. So 50 years after Shakespeare wrote this play, though, in England, there are anxieties that are reflected in this play, as eventually a republic is set up in England when they execute the king. Okay, so there's anxiety about what England could become following the death of the childless and unmarried Elizabeth. So it's about Rome and Julius Caesar, but it's also about England and Queen Elizabeth. Go ahead and pause the video and read this. Before you're ready, in 49 BC, a group of Roman senators, allied with Pompey and fearing the power of Caesar, ordered the general to disband his army or be considered a traitor. When Caesar received this decree, he was in Gaul with only 5,000 men, with the rest of his legions in the north, campaigning. He had no intention of obeying the decree. That would have been suicide, but it was weeks before the bulk of his army could join him. But he wouldn't wait, so he said, let the die be cast. And he and his 5G troops crossed the Rubicon, the river marking the border between Gaul, what we'd call France in today's parlance, and Italy, again, Roman Empire. He led troops into Italian soil. This meant war. There was no turning back. He was compelled to concentrate his forces, not waste a single man, act with speed, and be creative. He marched on Rome. He seized the initiative. He frightened the senators. They all took off with Pompey. So if we wait too long to act, particularly when we face no outside pressure, it's sometimes better to act before you think you're ready to force the issue. Not only will you take your opponents by surprise, you'll also have the best use of your resources. You've committed yourself, you can't turn back, and so that'll pressure you to use your creativity to flourish. Do this often, and you'll be able to think and act fast on your feet. The strongest poison ever known came from Caesar's laurel crown, according to William Blake. In other words, success casts a spell over us. Here's a brief video that probably won't work. Oh, it does work. Good. There's Caesar. Takes his seat in the forum. All the senators suspicious of him. This is from HBO's Rome, an amazing series. Mark Antony, Caesar's right-hand man. Remember 2 consuls? Now just 1. This is Brutus. He's not happy.
The Senate will hear Marcus Tullius Cicero.
Cicero, great speech giver, writer, powerful politician.
On this eve of his most glorious triumph, I move that Gaius Julius Caesar be made imperator and granted absolute power over Rome for a period of 10 years.
Look at the face of Caesar, the poise. How will they react? Out of fear. Reminds me of the... I'll say it in a second. Brutus.
As some of you know, Caesar and I have had our disagreements.
They had a war.
However that may be, he has shown himself to be as wise and merciful in victory as he was invincible in battle. Let this be an end to division and civil strife. I willingly pledge my loyalty to him, and I urge you all to do the same. I heartily commend the motion proposed by Marcus Tullius Cicero.
The motion is carried unanimously.
Many of you here today fought against me. Many of you wished me dead. Many of you perhaps still do. But I hold no grudges and seek no revenge. I demand only this, that you join with me in building a new Rome. A Rome that offers justice, peace, and land to all its citizens, not just the privileged few. Support me in this task, and old divisions will be forgotten. Oppose me, and Rome will not forgive you a second time. Senators! The war is over.
Always a good thing. Look, Brutus and Cicero were compelled to say the things they said, but they said them nonetheless. Out of fear, out of hope that Caesar would be a good leader. Caesar seems like a pretty good leader to me in this portrayal, at least. But notice how the clapping was really weak at first. It reminds me of in Stalin's era in the Soviet Union. They were applauding Stalin for like 10 minutes, literally. He'd already left the room. And one guy sat down after the 10 minutes of applause. The first guy that sat down, Stalin had killed. Later, Khrushchev, the guy that took over after Stalin, someone shouted at him, why didn't you do something with Stalin? And Khrushchev said, who said that? And of course, the person didn't admit saying it, whoever it was. And he said, now you know why I never said anything. In other words, I was afraid of Stalin just like you were, and that's why I never said anything. Khrushchev making the point. Really powerful, I think. So in this short opening Act 1, Scene 1, we get a view of the city in crisis. It's unstable. Shakespeare sets the scene obliquely, suggesting uncertainty and contradiction, because the triumph described is over Caesar's enemy and Rome's former favorite general, Pompey the Great, and his sons. And so instead of firm authority, the play opens with a mob, and by equivocations that challenge order, The punning of idol creatures and idol-worshipping people is the first of many brilliant puns that say much more than we immediately discern. They are both inactive idol and counterfeit worshippers of a false idol, i.e. Caesar. The tribune's contempt for those they serve reveals the view of the plebs as inferior, base, and vulgar. Indeed, they are out of touch with those they are supposed to represent. The pronoun thou was used to address family or friends affectionately, servants good-humoredly, strangers contemptuously. Okay, so thou, it matters to whom you're speaking as to how we should take the thou. Okay, speaking to animals or God, you did so solemnly. Thou art great, God, or something like that. There's a pun on cobbler, which is used as both a mender of shoes, one who plays with words, and a bungler. This begins a mocking back and forth with the pleb and the tribune. A knave is a base and crafty rogue, saucy in this era, meant ill-mannered or lewd. Cobble doubles as couple. Owl becomes romantically charged. Wherefore, remember from Romeo and Juliet, means why. Wherefore art thou Romeo? Why are you named Romeo? It doesn't mean where are you Romeo. And your profession in Rome very much equaled your identity, who you were. There's this weird feast that's about to happen that, Caesar wants to make sure Antony helps him, have a baby, because of course as a leader, emperor, king, you need descendants to carry on your work. Bread and circuses, that's how you appease the Roman people. It's questionable to make a triumph considering you defeated not a foreigner, but a fellow Roman. The Republic is drawing itself over division and conflict. This is something like what a Roman triumph would have looked like. Yep. Okay, big shocker. Every video that's useful for education, YouTube takes down. Thanks for nothing, YouTube. It's really cool. It's probably still on there somewhere. Google HBO Triumph Caesar, see if it comes up. His main source is Plutarch's Lives of the Noble Grecians and Romans. So this is based on historical treatise. Shakespeare sometimes plagiarizes from those treatises. Brene Brown, she says it's unproductive and hurtful to drop at the feet of your unarmored self. And no matter how much your self-doubt wants to scoop up the criticism and snuggle with the negativity so it can form its worst fears, or how eager the shame gremlins are to use the hurt to fortify your armor, take a deep breath and find the strength to leave what's mean-spirited on the ground. You do not even have to stomp it or kick it away. Cruelty is cheap, easy. It's not something you want to do. It does not deserve your energy or engagement. Just step over the comments and keep daring, always remembering that armor is too heavy a price to pay to engage with cheap seat feedback. And she means take off your armor, right? Take off your protection. Be a little vulnerable with the people in the classroom, the people you're working with. In fact, get a 1 by 1 inch square of people and write down the names of all the people whose opinions matter to you. The size of this forces you to edit. Fold it, put it in your wallet or your purse. Reach out to those people. Say something like, I'm getting clear on whose opinions matter to me. Thank you for being one of those people. I'm grateful you care enough to be honest and real with me. Wherefore rejoice, what conquest brings he home? We shouldn't be celebrating. He defeated a fellow Roman, this guy, the Tribune says, not Pompey. Disrobe the images if you do find them decked with ceremonies. In other words, if there's streamers and stuff on the Caesar statues, take them down. Here is supposedly what Julius Caesar looked like according to a modern rendition. Pretty close here, right? When Caesar says, do this, it's performed. This is similar to, I now pronounce you man and wife, or I dub thee Sir Lancelot. Will and shall are the words of the monarch, and whatever they say becomes reality. Beware the Ides of March, the soothsayer warns. Will Caesar take his advice? Civil war is dreadful, and Brutus is having a civil war with himself. He's torn between his conflicting feelings, his private friendship with Caesar and his public dislike of dictatorship, of any absolute rule that approaches the condition of godhead. And this is pretty much the conflict. Okay, Brutus is at war with himself over what to do about this Caesar thing who's taken over the Republic and turned it into a dictatorship. What would you do if your best friend took over? Would you trust them to lead you to a promised land, to a golden land? Or would you fear that they would become a despot, like a modern-day Vladimir Putin or the Chinese leadership?